And, you know, the case is never closed and discussion is always allowed. It has to be. And that statement can be applied to pretty much any issue, but I'm going to talk about today the residential school grave sites. I mean, there's the revelation of the discovery of possibly over 200 unmarked graves at the site of a former Kamloops residential school, and it rocked the nation. I mean, our flags were kept at half-mast for almost half a year. Apologies came fast and furious from the government, and activists raged. The other consequence of the discovery was a flood of misinformation and exaggeration of what actually happened in residential schools. Unfounded anecdotes of abuses as horrific and absurd as the purposeful murder and cremation of babies were shared, and they're taken as fact. They weren't questioned because you would be shouted down. It was assumed that every single person who attended a residential school was there by force and they were abused, and that's just not true. To question any allegations would, and still leads, though, to allegations of racism and attempted cancellation by the media and the internet mob. This most recently happened when the Fort Times, a newspaper in Saskatchewan, ran a column by former Judge Brian Geisbrecht, where he pointed out that not a single body has been confirmed yet at that site in Kamloops. Similar radar findings have indicated potential graves at a spot in Nova Scotia, Charles Camsell Hospital in Alberta, Cooper Island, BC, and Brantford, Ontario. Radar showed similar things underground, but when excavations were conducted, there were no bodies actually found. It doesn't mean there aren't burials at the Kamloops site. It does mean, though, we can't be sure what's going on until they're exhumed. We can't assume. Now, Geisbrecht also said that 832 people died at residential schools, mainly from tuberculosis, when they had already had it when they enrolled in the school. Most would have died if they'd stayed at their homes as well. And I mean, if you don't believe that, that's fine. Let's study it, though. Let's discuss it. Like, these deaths are being attributed wrongly, and we should be allowed to discuss this. The next assumption being taken is as fact is that there are bodies, and that those bodies are of children from the residential schools. I mean, there was one site excavated in Eastern Canada, but then they found it actually carried the remains of Irish settlers. Unmarked and forgotten cemeteries aren't exclusive to any race or group. The term mass graves, that's another one. It's constantly being used by activists. There's been yet to be a single mass grave found. Using the term mass graves implies large holes where a number of bodies were dumped, and that never happened in Canada. While activists are trying to draw parallels, and that's what they're doing, between the Holocaust of World War II and with what happened in residential schools. They do so by loosely using the term genocide and labeling every single native who ever attended a residential school as a survivor. 6 million Jews were purposely slaughtered factory-style in World War II. Well over 500,000 Tutsis were exterminated in Rwanda during their civil war. In Canada, fewer than 150,000 students even attended residential schools over the period of 100 years. And yeah, some died while they're in those schools, but there was no purposeful effort to kill them. There was no genocide. And labeling every student as a survivor is an exaggeration. Records were meticulously kept by organizations managing the schools. They did so to ensure they got funding. It wasn't some altruistic thing. They wanted to get paid for those kids. They recorded every student entering and leaving those schools. There was no mass of missing children. None vanished without record while attending the schools. A myth has been perpetuated that thousands disappeared. That simply isn't true, and we need to be able to point that out. Are there graves of children at some former residential school sites? It only stands to reason that there would be. Those schools were harsh places 100 years ago. They were underfunded, and the West was barely developed. Many children died in the early to mid-20th century of the Spanish flu, polio, tuberculosis, and this was both native and non-native kids alike. Students at residential schools were particularly vulnerable, as they had little natural immunity to those diseases. They were not always fed balanced nutritional diets, and they lived in crowded quarters that lent themselves to disease transmission. It was wrong to put kids in that situation and pack them into those schools, but let's not allow these claims of genocide to stand unquestioned and unfounded, because they're unfounded. Don't let them stand that way. It wasn't easy to transport the remains of a person a century ago. Bodies were often buried close to the place of death as a means of practicality, and they were usually marked with nothing more than a wooden cross. Over a century, those crosses decayed and disappeared. The cemeteries were forgotten. It wasn't a purposeful effort to hide them, though. There were abuses and there were tragedies in those schools, and we should investigate and find out what they're about. Any abusers still alive today, and if their abuse can be proven, they should be charged. We need to critically study what happened in those residential schools, but we won't be able to if the debate is shouted down and unfounded allegations remain unquestioned. How can we achieve closure and final reconciliation if we don't have all the facts? I fear that many activists and lawyers don't want to see closure or reconciliation, though, because they profit greatly off the cash settlements and ongoing anger. They perpetuate myths and keep the anger inflamed for their own benefit. Well, the discussion is never closed, and we're going to carry it on.